Hello and welcome as we come to the middle of the Christmas season, and wishes again for a very happy and holy Christmas to each and all of you. As the traditional Sunday within the octave of Christmas has been for many years now dedicated to the most holy family of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, and in a certain way it is appropriate to remember the family, is it not, Bethlehem during the Christmas season. So the readings for this time, the first reading comes from the book of Sirach, chapter 3, verses 2 through 6, and verses 12 through 14. Second reading comes from the letter to the Colossians, chapter 3, verses 12 through 21. And the gospel this time comes from the gospel according to Luke, chapter 2, verses 41 through 52. Now, a little bit of a background to this. As we know, in the gospel tradition of Luke, there are really 7 major episodes, and of the first 6, 3 match the ones with regard to John, match the 3 which has something to do with Jesus. That brings us to the 7th and final episode, which in many ways is unique to the gospel traditions, and certainly, as we have noticed, is found only in the third gospel. In fact, there is some discussion, although we won't go into all of that, as to whether or not the 2 opening chapters of Luke were actually additions to the original work of this gospel. In other words, it would have seemed that Luke's story began with chapter 3, but for all kinds of reasons and some even early challenges within the developing Christian experience, there was seen a need on the part of this writer to include what we call now the conception and birth narratives about Jesus. But the chapter we look at this time is unique in the sense that it pictures a story relating to Jesus and the family, Mary and Joseph, that take place when Jesus is 12 years old. Now, a little bit of background in this regard, and since it has to do with family, I thought that a couple of ideas about family, particularly from the viewpoint of the first century or the Mediterranean world time, might be important. Because in Mediterranean agrarian societies, boys and girls were brought up together until the age of puberty. And they were always brought up by women. Now that would include his mother, aunts, sisters, and women who were part of the village or town that they were part of. And in this society, the mother and the oldest son, and of course in this case, since he was the only son at this point, would be Jesus, the mother had enormous power over her son's life. And boys who approached the age even of adulthood still felt the kind of influence of the mother. That may be why in other places later on, it's not part of what we'll look at today, mother-in-law is also mentioned because of this relationship that mothers had with eldest son, particularly, with all her sons, but particularly with the firstborn. Boys, as we have mentioned, in this society were highly valued, and women, therefore, because of their value, were often pictured as pampering and pleasuring them. A boy, for example, was breastfeeded twice as long as a girl. and even longer after he was able to speak. Now that's interesting. And we find emphasis of this in 2 Malachi, chapter 7, verse 27, if you're interested in that. So as a consequence, boys entered puberty with a kind of ambiguous identity, having, for example, no male model during this time. We don't know, they didn't know exactly how to become a man in society. And so when he reached, that is the boy, reached 12, 13, but usually it was the time of 12, and we notice that this is the age of Jesus in the episode that we will hear this time from Luke's story. Would often be, when they came in now into the company of men, treated a little strictly. Sometimes, now we're not sure just how often this happened, but even a young adult, or now we would call him probably an adolescence, but keep in mind that there were only two stages of life in this world, namely child and adult. So we did not have adolescents or young people as we do today. That may have solved some of the problems then that adult or adolescents as our society are often experiencing. And those of you who are parents of teenagers certainly are aware of what some of those situations turn out to be. So the men would teach the boy now, coming from puberty, his place and the behavior that was expected of him. What I was started to say is some believe that even physical punishment or beatings were given to a boy in order to strengthen him and to get him right, and often to be able to accept in a stoic manner suffering in order to demonstrate his manliness. Now, all of that is a little bit of a background for the episode that we're looking at this time. What are we looking at? Most likely, this is the celebration of one of the three major feasts observed by all the Jewish community, but most likely it was the Feast of Passover. And so Jesus, along with Mary and Joseph, have come up to Jerusalem for this celebration. Now, what is central here, and this, by the way, is an important theme developed by the gospel writer Luke, is the temple. Two things emerge here, that Jesus meets in the temple with an adult group of men and teachers, and it isn't the first time that Jesus is presented in the temple. Early on, we found that 40 days after Jesus was born, again according to a tradition of the time, Mary and Joseph had brought Jesus to the temple. Now again, it would be the temple area, not necessarily the temple building inside itself. And that there, and this episode is also recorded, we have looked at it another week between the celebration of Christmas and New Year's, is greeted by Simeon and Anna in the temple area, and it is there that Simeon blesses the child, and it is there that Anna meets the parents and blessings and all of that. So that is not, this rather is not the first time that Jesus had come to the temple, but it is there he was brought in as an infant. Now he is 12. So what are we saying when he's 12 years old? Well, is he still a child ready to enter adulthood, or has he already made across that threshold and is an adult? And if so, and that would be the reason why Jesus could do some things on his own without necessarily having his parents' approval. And so, what's the episode? Well, I'm sure that you're familiar with the episode, but simply to put it quickly in place, as a faithful family, Mary and Joseph and Jesus had come up for the Passover. Again, the journey from Nazareth would have not happened in overnight, and so it would have probably been in caravan style, and that's why sometimes the boys and men grouped together, the women grouped with their group, okay? So they didn't travel together is what we're trying to say. However, they come up to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast. When it is over, they return, and again perhaps return in the same caravan style, men with men, women with women, and at a certain point discover that Jesus is not with them, and well, has Jesus been lost? Where is he? He's not with the men, he's not with the women. They can only surmise that somehow he has remained back in Jerusalem, and so now they began a 3-day search, or takes them 3 days. Good, always you like the 3, because how often the 3 remember at the end of 3, some event, some revelation takes place. So often in biblical, we've noticed this on a number of occasions, how the number 3 often refers to on the 3rd day or in the 3rd day. In this occasion, it's on the 3rd day that Mary and Joseph discover Jesus where? In the temple, okay? So again, this theme of temple comes to the fore. And where do they find Jesus? They find Jesus with the teachers in the temple area, listening and answering questions. Now, we have noticed this on other occasions. Most pictures of this scene, developed by artists later on, picture Jesus as sitting there teaching these men, who are the wise men, the learned men, we presume the kind of Pharisees or rabbis of the time. But it might be incorrect to see Jesus as teaching in that manner. Rather, he might be pictured as listening to what these men of wisdom have to say and asking interesting questions, insightful questions, and then kind of receiving or giving an answer to the questions that are being given. It's a little different manner of noticing how Jesus is teaching, not taking over the scene in sitting kind of in the seat of authority, but rather as one of those who are learning what is the tradition of Israel. And keep in mind, in the study of the scripture that is very traditional in Jewish tradition, is that of asking questions. Someone makes a statement, well, about the scripture particularly, or about the Torah, or the Talmud, and if that later on was the case, would not simply accept it as a given, but might raise or would raise a question with regard to it. Now, sometimes that sounded argumentative, as if the questioner was not believing. Well, that usually was not the method or purpose here, but it was by asking questions of what was being taught, you learn something. Each new question gets an answer that maybe you hadn't heard before, or that if you had heard before, you could kind of reassimilate into your own understanding. So all of this is interesting in kind of keeping in mind what is the background of what's going on in this scene. And it would also explain why Jesus could kind of branch off on his own. If indeed he was now in the adult stage, well, did he have to ask his mom and dad for permission to stay behind? It would have been nice if he had, okay? Now notice what Mary's questions to Jesus is. Son, why have you treated, and this would be one translation of this, why have you treated us like this? Now, in that case, Jesus certainly could have done what he did, but it wouldn't have been nice to tell his parents that that he was staying behind. So you either get a sense that Mary a little bit is berating Jesus for what he has done, but Jesus' response is, well, why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my Father's house? Now, it's interesting to note here how Father is understood. He's not saying in the household that we came from, namely that you and Joseph have provided, but rather Father here is the Lord. And so this is one of those statements in which the kind of uniqueness of Jesus now comes to the fore in the gospel tradition, as Luke tells it. Did you not know? And again, that's interesting. Did you not know? Now, as you know, in the language, you can be both the singular, you, me, you, or you, the group. So it can have a plural sense. And that, interestingly, is how did you not know? Did you not know? Is Jesus therefore addressing this simply to Joseph and Mary, but also to the larger audience who is listening to this message? So again, attention sometimes to the language can be interesting, can it not be, in kind of gaining some information ourselves. Jesus, how is he pictured here? Is he irritated with Mary because of what she has said? Or is he acting kind of in the sense, well, he grew up with the women and kind of is more apologetic in his response? Again, I suppose that's how, and when you hear it read this weekend in the gospel or proclamation, listen to how the tone is given, because tones do, and we've noticed this, and I'm sure you've noticed this, tones do make a difference, do they not, in sometimes in the way in which things have are said or done. So those now, in a certain way, and that's why I started by saying that the first time that Jesus had been brought to the temple during the time of Simeon and Anna, and you remember Simeon had said that a sword of sorrow would also pierce Mary's heart, okay? So is this now a fulfillment or a continuation of that thought that Simeon had placed there? That indeed a reminder that, and if those of you who are parents, or even if you're not, could imagine the pain and suffering that went on as Joseph and Mary for 3 days were looking for this child, okay? Anyone who has lost a child, even for 1 day, I'm sure, understands that there was suffering that went on, and now you have misunderstanding that Jesus is presenting to them, but indeed that is also a form of suffering. So is the kind of fulfillment or the continuation of Simeon's insight with regard to the child, and says, Simeon had said, this sign shall be a sign of contradiction. Well, is Jesus in some ways already contradicting what is expected? After all, here he is demonstrating, and I go back to this, demonstrating an important quality, is he not? As he sits in the temple, after all, and we will see in this gospel that throughout the ministry of Jesus, he is making a great journey that ultimately brings him to the temple, where the conclusion of the events that lead to our salvation take place. But Jesus' presence here announces in a certain way through Jesus, again, the presence of God. So those who are responding, that is, the learned teachers there, are astonished. Perhaps they are surprised, shocked, and stupefied by the kind of questions that Jesus is raising. Now, the gospel writer does not tell us what they are, and so we have no way of really knowing exactly what they were discussing to begin with, and secondly, what the questions on the part of Jesus might have been. But they are kind of impressed by the fact that this young man has kind of the ability to perhaps ask the kind of questions that are challenging and which will give rise to understanding things that perhaps had not been previously thought about. So the conclusion, as we will hear of this episode, by the way, is that after this, Jesus returns to Nazareth. He goes back to his parents, with his parents, and there the child grows in age and in wisdom before God and before men. So in a certain way, the conclusion of this episode nicely brings Jesus back to a harmonious relationship with his parents in Nazareth, where he had grown up. But as I mentioned, this episode really is the only episode that tells us something that happens between the conception of Jesus, and although certainly next time when we come to Matthew, we will see that there are other connections with the child that is born there. But here we have Jesus at that, if you want, perimeter or middle point between childhood and adult. And I would suggest that perhaps it is the adulthood idea that is the point that Luke would make. He wants to picture Jesus being there as a child, as an adolescent, a young adult, and then later, certainly as the Messiah, fulfilling the promises and the needs that the gospel points out. We have noticed on other occasions that the second reading comes from Colossians. Those of you who read the whole section may find some parts of it a little difficult. We have noticed this before, and I just want to quickly point out that what the Colossian letter here is emphasizing are what are called household codes, which were prevalent in the Greco-Roman world. Remember that this is particularly a patriarchal society in which men have total control. And it is, however, as this reading, if you listen to it carefully, points out that the male responsibility in family relationships is to keep order, and in fact it is radically altered by the way in which the writer here presents things. So all of that, a little bit of background as this week we look at Holy Family. I thought, with a little time that we have, that as you also know, beginning on the 25th of this year and running for a week is the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah, which again has to do with the centrality of the temple in Jewish life. And so there is a certain connection here between what we've been speaking about this time, the temple, and Judaism. I'm sure you perhaps are somewhat familiar with this particular celebration, which may well have been one that Jesus and his family also observed, although I'm not sure they would have necessarily come up to Jerusalem for this. But in the year 167, before the common time, the Assyrian Greek soldiers had taken over the city of Jerusalem. This was done under the aegis of a leader named Antiochus Epiphanes IV. How do you like that, to say that 3 times quickly? Who entered the city, entered the temple, and erected, so the story goes, had erected in the temple area a shrine in honor of one of the Greek gods. He also was arguing that the Judeans should follow more Hellenic customs, and one of them was to be the abandonment of circumcision. Now, this gave rise, as you know, to a revolt on the part of one of the families known as the Maccabean family. And the most famous of the names connected here is Judas Maccabeus. Now, by the way, in our Catholic tradition, there are three books that deal with this episode. The first and second books of Maccabees deals with stories that have to do with the Maccabean rebellion, and sections of the book of Daniel also was written during the time of this reform or this revolution. What happens is that the Maccabeans are able to successfully take the city of Jerusalem, and there is therefore a period of rededication of the temple. So my point is that the temple is an interesting theme that runs through both the Jewish celebration at this time and our Christian looking at the story of Jesus being found in the temple. The miracle of miracles, as you know, they had to tear down the altar dedicated to the other gods, re-erect an altar in honor of Yahweh, in honor of the true God. And that the interesting tradition is that they had only enough oil in the lamp to last for one day. And but as good stories go, the oil lasted a second day, a third day, and yes, lasted until an eighth day. And so this gave birth to a traditional period of time in Jewish life for celebrating important events. So Hanukkah, which probably in the Jewish life of the first century was not one of the three major holidays or holy days, but it was gaining when one thinks this had happened about a century and a half before Jesus' time, but by Jesus' time was now gaining popularity. And in our culture, particularly in the American culture, Hanukkah has gained a great deal of more importance in our Jewish community. Part of it, of course, is lights. You can see why Hanukkah is known as the Feast of Lights in Judaism. Why? Because of this. Well, we look around, we are, as Christians and Catholics, lighting up a lot, right? Whether it be our trees, our windows. Now, if you go outside, many houses on the outside are lighted up. So this commonality, a season of the celebration of lights, and a time of gift giving. Certainly that we'll see how that also takes place. So during this time, they have a special menorah of 8 days. A new candle is lit each day. They use what is called a dreidel, and there's a special kinds of food. Well, I thought, just as we conclude, you probably all know what a dreidel is. It looks something like this. It's like a top. On it are 4 symbols. I know you will not be able to see this, but 4 symbols. And depending on where it lies, so you spin it like that. Not a good spin. How about this one? There you go. When it lands, if you get the right one, you get a prize. If you get another one, you got to go. So this is a little bit of a tradition within Judaism that maybe we observe. Well, as we come to an end, may indeed a reminder that Jesus has become part of our family. And at the, upcoming will be the end of the calendar year for us. So wishes for all of you who have been with us over these over this time and over this season. Wishes for a very happy and holy New Year as we will be celebrating the Feast of Mary, the Mother of God. So all of that, it's a season, a time of rich celebration for us Christians. Thank you for being with us, and the very best to you this day and throughout the new year.